and harness the power of utilisation, which is a bit of a mouthful, but hopefully it gives you an insight into what we're going to be talking about today. So before we get stuck in, I am the moderator, Bridget. I'm the marketing manager here at BabelQuest, which is an elite HubSpot partner. And I'm basically here to hopefully keep all of our speakers within the time limit and ask them some questions. So speaking of, I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. So Matt, if we can start with you, and then Phil, and then finally Chris, just give everybody an overview of who you are, what you're good at, that kind of thing.
Oh man, I'm not good at much. I spend a lot of time thinking about getting adoption, specifically in HubSpot use cases and ecosystems. I have a tool that a tool called Super that I think about. It's a digital adoption platform. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how to get people to do things they don't want to do. So I'm excited to be here and talk about how do you convince people that you can make their life better through HubSpot.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, for me, I am Phil Agnew. I host the UK's #1 marketing podcast called Nudge, and I'm senior product marketer at a company called Buffer. And I know even less than Matt, definitely, about this topic. So I'm coming in definitely blind. But I do know a lot about consumer behavior and psychology. I interview experts in that field on my show. So I'm hoping I can share a bit around the psychological reasons behind how people get hooked on a platform, how to get to people engaged in a platform, and hopefully help you out with some of those insights.
Oh, that's over to me. I'm Chris. I'm a consultant at BabelQuest. I implement new HubSpot portals and kind of focus on the people training adoption aspect of it. I work with a team who deal with a lot of the tech side. And a little starstruck, avid listener to Phil's podcast. Last year did Matt's RevOps Summer School, which was a lot of fun. So yeah, I've been looking into Supered, which is a very cool piece of kit. So yeah, excited to share some time with you both.
Amazing. Thanks, guys. So a little bit boring bit before we start, some housekeeping. I've just started the Q&A, so if you can pop any questions in there, and then, as I mentioned before, chit chat in the chat section. I've clicked record. We'll share it at the end. I'm sure we'll mention various resources throughout today, and I'll make sure to share all of that with you afterwards as well. So let's get started with all things adoption. It's pretty broad, and I think a bit of a buzzword, which is why we kind of stuck to a framework. So those that don't know what that is, it's understanding the barriers, needs assessment, listen, outcome, create, and knowledge. So it's 6 steps. And we're going to talk through each of those, get some insight, ask our speakers some questions. And I think the biggest step is obviously understanding those barriers to adoption. So we're going to start with Phil. On your recent podcast, you talk actually about how you can't really make people do what you want, but how can understanding psychology, behavioral consumerism, etc., how does that help get people going?
Yeah.
A little kick.
Yeah. Or a little nudge. And that honestly is what I think a lot of psychologists spend a lot of time researching. So adoption is it can be very tricky. People are habitual, they have habits, they follow those habits diligently, and they don't love change. We all know that feeling of being told what to do and not wanting to do that thing. It's something called reactance. So when we're told to do something, we often don't want to do it. But there are things we can do to make adoption a lot easier. And one of the things that I think is really useful with psychology is you can look at studies in adjacent fields and apply them to your own field. So there is this wonderful study from 2006 by a researcher called Nunes. And that study was conducted with coffee shops. And in the coffee shop, so what does a coffee shop got to do with adoption? Well, basically, if you own a cafe or a coffee shop, you want people to adopt your coffee shop. You want them to keep coming back and back and back, and to feel very habitual about coming to your store. So how do coffee shops do that? Well, they do it with loyalty cards, of course. They create loyalty cards, and that gives people a reason to keep coming back. But the psychologists asked themselves a question. They said, is there something we can do to these loyalty cards to make adoption even more impactful? And so they ran an experiment where customers got one of 2 loyalty cards. One loyalty card had 9 stamps to fill in to get your coffee. The other only had 7. except when they gave them out, the 9 stamp card, the barista, as they gave that one out, would stamp in the first 2. So you'd get the first 2 for free. Now, these cards are identical. They both need 7 coffees to be bought in order to get your free coffee. The 9 one had 2 stamps automatically put in. The 7 one, you just had the 7. And yet, the researchers found that when you were given the card which had the 2 stamps put in for free at the start, people were 84% more likely to come back. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us a few things. One, we are reciprocal creatures. We like to return favors. So when somebody gives us a favor, like 2 free coffees or what we perceive to be free coffees, we're more likely to adopt and come back. 2 is that once a task has begun, we feel a need to complete it. So with that coffee card voucher, you're thinking, oh, I've already got 2. I should keep getting more to get to the end. You can think about ways you could apply this to whatever community you're trying to get people to adopt. And then the third is ownership. So we feel like we have a real need to continue or to go towards something that we feel ownership towards. So once you have ownership over this loyalty card, you're more likely to keep coming back. And I think there's really interesting ways we can apply that. And the most simple takeaway for people listening is giving something away for free, making people feel like they've started a journey with you will help adoption. And I think it works for cafes, and I think it should work for all types of communities as well.
I love that. So it's kind of making everybody feel important throughout the journey, and then they'll keep coming back and they'll keep taking part and carrying that on.
Exactly that. Yeah, exactly that.
That makes sense. And I think that goes quite nicely into specific barriers that people feel. So Chris, you've worked with obviously a lot of companies to help adopt new platforms. And everybody has got their own barrier to that, why they're not going to adopt it or why they want to adopt it, etc. But what are the most common, do you think, users face?
I think you get barriers around the whole people, process, technology, all of which are likely to cause problems. Poor process is a big one. You often see people going, right, we've got an old CRM, we're going to gut it, we're going to move to a lovely new one, but we're going to bring all the same old rubbish across, and we're going to keep trying to make people follow these outdated processes that don't work and cause problems. And then you also get sort of quite a lot of people barriers where you're looking at sort of capability, opportunity, motivation, and typically where you see problems, it's where people are trying to solve for the wrong barrier. They're trying to look at capability. They're trying to go, right, we're going to give everyone lots of training, when actually there's a lot of complexity at the motivation side of things. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that people just don't like change. You need to make people feel heard. You need to make them feel like they've got skin in the game. So a lot of it comes down to actually just involving people in the process from the start, communication, building a good system that actually makes it easier for them to do what they want to do in the CRM than circumventing it and going back to whatever old system they use. So it's a hugely complex area, but I think a lot of it comes to just understanding people and their needs and making it easy for them to do their job in the system without having to do other things, to learn other things, and to always be asking people for help. So I think that's really how it will boil down.
That's good. So I think both of you have kind of said it needs to be personal. Everybody's got their own problems. And in that, I guess the strategies need to match that. So Matt, I know that you've obviously, again, you've worked with a lot of businesses to encourage adoption. What strategies have you found are the most effective in breaking down barriers and getting them to embrace the change?
I've said, I just have so many ideas. I'm going to call this down. First off, Phil, I understand why you have one of the most popular podcasts. That was brilliant. I just want to sit here and listen to you all day. I spent, for better or worse, I used to be in the U.S. military. I was an officer, and inside of that, I had a group of individuals, often didn't want to be where they were, doing tasks they didn't want to do with a specific way they didn't want to do it. And I had tactics I could use to help them clean the latrines or clean rifles, or count supplies there were thousands of things. It was monotonous and just there was no purpose to it in their mind, right? But they needed to be done. So there's tactics here. Number one, I have authority. Like, so I can say, hey, if you don't do this thing, you will have there will be excruciating pain. That is always the least effective way to get adoption of anything, because while it may get you short-term gain, it will get you long-term pain. That's how rebellions start and how you get ousted and how you have insurrection. So while it be used, it should be used rarely. Number two, there's inspiration. There is, hey, guys, if you had to understand that if we don't have these supplies, we're not counting our ammunition or ammo or whatever we're looking at. If we were deployed and we were asked to go somewhere and we were missing this, there are lives at stake. So it's connecting it to my monotonous task, connecting it to a larger vision, and inspiring that you are part of a larger story. And to do this thing, you can then execute and you can feel fulfillment in what you're doing. But then number three is there's also this camaraderie portion to show, hey, I will induce and be part of this pain with you. And so if you do like these three things, is you never need to hold your big stick and use it. You just, everybody knows you have it. So I like to do inspiration, connecting your monotonous task, small tasks, to a larger goal and outcome. And number one is often you need to be part of it. And so what this looks like in a CRM, like a CRM, if I'm an executive in a company that's implementing a new CRM, say called HubSpot, you better run your meetings out of the HubSpot CRM. That's how you sit with them. Hey, I will be part of the pain. I can't answer the questions, but I will expect your thing. And there's an expectation that comes with this. And these shared expectations create a team, and a shared team creates a shared mission. And so then you talk about and should say, and here's what will happen if we do this thing together. And so you need this 5-year plan. We're going to this location. We're going to march up this hill. It will be painful. And a thing that just exists across any change is when you have somebody changing a process, they must believe in you, because any change, there's inherent risk, and risk means, and you are asking someone to get worse at their job with the hope they will be better. So you must be the bridge that they could be across that. And so I think it comes down to those two fundamental things: being with them in the pain, and then providing the inspiration and the hope and the bridge across that barrier. So we have a framework I like to use for those things, but I just generally that's how it's set, and that's how I see any change in that context.
I love that. I'm just trying to think of how we can take CRM adoption and make it a life or death outcome, but I don't know. I don't know if I can stretch it that far. But I think that's. I think setting those expectations right at the start, when you're unlocking these barriers, you're going to set yourself up for success essentially if you just communicate. And that, I guess, communicating as well leads to getting them to be inspired by you, because you're being honest, accountable, and all of that good stuff.
Yes, healthy level of vulnerability when you miss it. So
yeah, I love that. Okay, I think that covers the barriers. Talked about getting personal, the strategies for that, what's worked, what hasn't worked. So the next stage of the framework is needs assessment. So it's essentially where you need to find out what your users need from your new platform. So an anonymous survey, workshops, those are kind of typical ways to get that information. So Phil, back to you on how we can use science to get everybody involved and responding, and any tips you've got on that.
Oh, it's such a good question, isn't it? How do you get people to respond to your survey? it's really tricky.
Marketing question.
Yeah, and it's something that has been studied. And there's this wonderful study from 2009. It's called I've got it written down here: Image Induction and Social Influence is the study, if anyone wants to look it up. And the study is the name is boring, but the study is very interesting, because what the researchers needed to do is they basically position themselves on street corners and ask pedestrians who are walking by to stop and answer a survey. Now, all of us hate this, right? I hope I'm not alone, but whenever you're walking down the street, you've got somewhere to go. You don't want to stop. You've got to get on with your daily task. And this is very similar to the people who are receiving an email from you asking, can you answer this survey from us? Nobody wants to do it. We're all too busy. But these researchers thought that there would be ways principles they could use to better engage people and make them more likely to answer their survey. And so they tried two things. So they had the control. That's when they just stood on the street corner and asked people, would you mind answering this survey for us? And I think it was something like 29% of people agreed to answer the survey. So not a huge amount, not a small amount. You will get quite a few responses if you just ask people to answer a survey. You will. And then you could obviously pay them. That's very cost. It's not very cost effective though. So you probably don't want to do that. There's a much smarter thing you can do. And it's what these researchers discovered, which is to ask them a different question to begin. So don't ask them, will you answer this survey? Instead, the researchers would ask people who are walking past, are you a helpful person? And that's very difficult not to answer that question. One, because it's quite distinct in your mind. You hear it and you think, oh yeah, I am. Or you just think, oh, that's interesting to answer. And then when you ask that question, if I asked everybody listening here, are you a helpful person? I guarantee you everybody would say yes. You'd have to be very odd not to say yes. And so you're then engaged in the survey. You've answered one question, you started the process, and it meant that the number of people who actually ended up filling out the survey went from 29%, which was our control, up to 77.3% for that variant. And what they revealed basically is if you ask someone this calibrating question and get them to acknowledge that they are helpful, they will be far more likely to be helpful and answer that survey for you. So a very simple way of applying this is just to literally ask people when you're asking for a survey, put in your email subject line, are you a helpful person? And get them to go for it that way. There are other ways as well. So later on in the experiment, they tried something else, and they were trying to get people to give their email addresses to receive more information about a new energy soft drink that was coming out. And rather than say, are you a helpful person? Because giving your email address isn't necessarily something that someone helpful would do. So there was a bit of wasn't much of a link there. They asked something different. They said, this is again to the people passing by, are you adventurous? And again, almost everyone would say yes. And so they said yes, they came in. And then the amount of people who gave their email addresses to hear more about this energy drink went from 33% from the control, where they just said, would you give your email address, up to 75% when they said, are you adventurous? So the push for people listening would be, what question can you ask that will actually inspire somebody to say yes and inspire them to actually go on and fill out the survey? Maybe is it, are you a community champion? Maybe is it, are you an expert within your field and can we have some of your information? Maybe it's something like that. But think about that first question you ask, because the question you ask to begin with dramatically affects how many people actually go and fill out your survey.
I love that. So it's invoking an emotion. And again, I guess it comes back to what you were saying earlier. It's making it about that individual and what they can bring to something. So Chris and Matt, what on the spot, but taking that, and obviously you both are CRM adoption experts, what would your subject line be? If you can think of one on the spot.
Yeah.
Very mean of me.
This goes back to my, maybe I believe in this, any CRM, just fundamental with the CRM is that it will be a difficult journey, but is it worth it? And this question people are constantly saying. And so I actually do this, and you'll hear me say this any place I am after I leave a call, every single time. I will say, stay awesome, keep doing it big, and never stop believing. And if I'm in a call and I'm in a thing, I will say when someone's at the end, and I use the 5 dysfunctions of a team. If you've heard of that construct of how to create this, which is number 1 is trust, number 2 is challenge, number 3 is commit, number 4 is accountability, number 5 is results. So I'm thinking about that, and I always say afterwards when I'll incite conflict, and then I'll say, I'll lead, do you believe? And so you're inviting, like, are you of interest? But it is like, hey, do you believe in the mission? And if yes, let's go do this thing. And so I would often, if I was doing internal emails and I would have that would be the question I would send to people. And you'd quickly know if people didn't believe, and you actually need to find detractors inside this and understand why. Anyway, that's what I would ask, and that's what I'd use.
I like that. And if they do say no, that does open up a wider conversation if they don't believe in the mission. So,
yes.
Chris, what about you?
I think probably help us make it better. I spent 20 years working in sales roles, so I'm now the poacher turned gamekeeper. I would be horrified at some of the things that I implement now, back in my first sales role. But it was always a case that nobody listened to the sales team. nobody gave a crap, to be honest, about what we wanted. It was all about management reporting. And so that or something like join us on this journey to make it better, I think, to try and just get that inspiration and help people believe, as Matt said, that we're trying to do something to make their lives better as opposed to make their lives more difficult.
So making it about them and the collective.
Yeah, and to make the point, I think in a CRM concept, it's about getting them to respond. It's not the yes and no matters less. So the no is actually more important. Do you believe? No, I want you to say that. And just as a point, it's good to get to traction in CRM so you can hear their point of view and then make the change.
Yeah, you don't want to be hearing just what you want to hear. You want to be hearing the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I guess that kind of brings it on to the next step really nicely, which is all about listening. So obviously very important. You've got all that information, but it's only as valuable as the time that you put into understanding it as well. So obviously with all this data, there's going to be trends. Chris, what should you be looking for in this?
So, I mean, one of the things I really like to do at the beginning of the process is actually just get the teams together without leadership. And I think going back to what Matt said again about people saying yes and people saying no, I actually genuinely will call that the whinge and moan session, because I want them to get it out and want to understand what's going on. And, we'll talk to leadership as well. But the things I'm looking for are things like friction. So specifically where one set of users might have needs that negatively impact another set of users. And that's something that happens a lot, and you'll see in a lot of CRM systems. Complexity, that's a big red flag when you start to see unnecessary complexity. And often you can see that if you start looking at the reporting that they're looking for. They're not thinking back from what is the answer to the big question that I need to answer. They're thinking, what can I do with all this disparate data? How can I make it look nice? So complexity and processes, like I said before, that's that whole concept of bad process remains bad process no matter what sort of system it's sitting in. So if you take something that doesn't work and put it in the new CRM, it's still not going to work, and people are still going to circumvent it, not use it, fill it in last place. So those sort of things, friction, complexity, and process would be probably the biggest things I'd be looking out for.
Good. And you mentioned senior leadership and like the board. And I know it's quite common that these systems are scoped based on what they've said. But question for you, Matt. Listening to the wrong people, obviously very bad. So how can you avoid that happening?
That question is layered with many variables and thoughts. Here's what I like to think. Anytime I'm listening to, and you have to have the session, and I like to take, you need a session with leadership, you need a session only leadership, and you need a session without them. And I the way I cut through the noise, because there is noise here. It is, I think in these two ways, and I only answer when I'm creating I think of a CRM as like a product, and I'm launching a product. So what is my minimum viable product that will be most effective that I can launch quickly? And I think about this construct. It is received. What are the questions in your job you must answer daily, weekly, and monthly? And if you can, and if from each department, and it's just anything else that doesn't fit that criteria, it's like, do you have to answer this daily, weekly, monthly? If it doesn't fit within that, it's not MVP, and you put it into some other chart that you're tracking off to go the parking lot. And then your initial build is those things, and that is both on the executive team and the IC team. But it's truly putting more for individual contributors have higher weight than executives to begin with. And the executives are often monthly. So if you're able to identify and listen to those three frequencies and provide a CRM that answers those questions, you will have an adopted system long term. And that helps you say who you're supposed to listen to, why you're supposed to listen to them, and what you actually need to build for your minimum viable product.
Okay, I think that pretty much covers listening. I think that you all kind of contributed to that really nicely. So we've done understanding the barriers, needs assessment, listening. Next up is outcome. So that's about actually building the platform. So at this point, about halfway through, what are some good tactics to keeping everybody engaged, Phil?
Engagement can be particularly tricky. It can be really hard to keep people coming back. But there is a tactic, at least that I know from the world of psychology, that seems to help. And it links back to that first thing I spoke about, which is ownership. When people feel a sense of ownership and control over something, they're more likely to keep engaging in it. We keep coming back to our Netflix because the algorithm shows that are relevant to us. We always load up Spotify because it's got the latest songs that it knows we'll like. There's a great study from Stuart Sutherland's book Irrationality, where he found that if you give people a lottery ticket with the numbers penciled in for them, so I give you a lottery ticket, Bridget, but I've already written in my numbers, you'll value that lottery ticket if I try to buy it back off you for about $1. This study was conducted in America. Whereas if I give you the same lottery ticket, and this is done of different populations of people, if I give you the same lottery ticket and you fill in your own numbers, so you have this sense of control, this sense of ownership, you apparently then value that ticket at almost $9. So 9 times increase in how much you would want me to buy it back off you for, which is rather incredible. And it showcases this power of ownership. And there's a really interesting study, which I think applies here even better, which is around giving customers a voice and how powerful that can be. This is a study with Michael Norton, very famed psychologist. And in his study, there was a whole experiment, which was or a whole part of the study, which is we won't talk about. But at the end, the individuals who were part of the study got paid. They got paid, I don't know, $100 or something. And this is actually where the study begins, because once they get paid, they then are told as they're leaving to put, I think it's like 20% of their paycheck into a box, because that's the lab tax. That's the tax they take off your payment to pay for this whole setup. And they found, this is going to surprise people, but most people didn't pay that tax. I think it's something like 45% of participants walked out the door and were like, I'm not paying for that. So most people didn't, engage in the same way that we're sort of thinking about today. And so Norton wondered, okay, how can I get people to engage with this thing and actually pay this tax? Well, let's lean on ownership again. So as they were leaving, instead of being told, I think they had a questionnaire which finished with like, please pay your tax as you leave. Instead of just being told, please pay your tax as you leave, it said, please pay your tax as you leave. And also let us know from a drop-down box where you would like this tax to be invested next time. So would you prefer better tea and coffee if you're a volunteer? Would you prefer better stationery? Would you prefer this? Would you prefer that? And so it gives them that sense of ownership. And just like with the lottery study, the amount of people who cheated and stole the tax went down from however high it was, maybe 30%, 40%, right down to, I think it was like 10% or 20%. So halved the amount of people who stole the tax. And all of this shows that if you want to encourage engagement, if you want to keep people coming back, one of the best things you can do is to give them ownership, to give them the ability to customize the space for how they want it to be, to give them the feeling that they have control and autonomy over decisions that are being made. Everything in the psychological literature seems to say that is a really good way of boosting engagement.
I love that. And I actually love the reference back to Netflix as well, and about the algorithm, because again, it's super personalized to you and what you've been doing. And I think that is the key point through what kind of everybody's been saying so far, is that everything needs to be tweaked to that person and, address their barrier, etc. So when we go through user testing, this is kind of the bit where you can like taste the finish line. And we're thinking, about getting people, keeping them engaged, thinking about training, onboarding. Matt, what does that look like for you to carry on that theme of engagement?
Received. I'm going to go just to bring up to go on Phil's point. Ownership is really difficult in the context of a CRM, especially when changing a property can cause the whole system to fall down. So how do you give people ownership in proxy, and how do you, as a user test, like be able to get true voices and help them like train and understand it? a lot of this, if you want to know how I think about this, you should do Super, because that is what what the whole tool does. But the way I think about it is, there are two things I would like to talk about. Number one is a framework called credit. And then also is, number two is a specific tactic that I think can be applicable to anyone here. So when I think about tactic is, number one is anytime you go into a CRM or a new system, you must be able to answer those 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why, every single time. So every moment when I'm doing a user is, hey, do you know who I should ask if I have a problem? Do you know what I should be doing right now? Do you know when I should be doing it? Do you know what you should be doing, and you know why you're doing it? And every user should be able to answer those questions every moment they're doing a process. And this goes to the next. And if they don't know, they should have a way of getting that answer. And this goes to the new way people, the Amazonification, as we would call it, of consumer or user behavior. It is, they must immediately have the ability to access that information. So I call this credit. How do you enforce the ability to get that information? You must celebrate when somebody does it right. You need to remind people when they're not doing it correctly, and you need to inspect people when, like, to make sure they're doing the right actions. You need to define what those actions are. You need to enforce those actions, and you need to train those actions. Now, there's robust ways. We call it credit. This is how admins get credit for the work. To get credit means you have adoption, and Super does some tactics. Let's give one tactic that's outside Super, because I want to be Super. It is this. I've implemented this over and over again, bonusly. And so this concept is, I give, as a company, people $10 a month, maybe, and within those, they have, we'll call that 100 points, $10. Every time they see an action done right, or they see celebrate, you can give someone one of your dollars. Once you have that dollar, you can accumulate them, and then you can buy something that you would like, either donate it or buy something on Amazon. I have found bonusly, or that as on top of any CRM platform, is one of the best ways to accelerate ownership, because it's a way to give people ownership of something and be able to own celebrating the right actions as a way to incentivize ownership, and create this, one of the ways to celebrate as part of that first C. And there are many more tactics. That's just one that I would call out for anyone here. That is a very useful and inexpensive way to get adoption and leverage CRM.
I love that. It's like positive reinforcement. And I think when people are going through adoption, they focus so much on the people that aren't doing it correctly, and they kind of get all of your attention. But actually, those people that are doing it correctly, they deserve to be celebrated, number one, because they've listened to you. And number two, they're the ones keeping it going. And they, in the future, are going to be your advocates and, your champions, and you want to nurture that relationship. So I love that. Matt, can you run through the acronym again for us?
I call it credit. It is, I'll say celebrate, remind, inspect, define, enforce, train.
Perfect. Yep. I'm going to write that on a Post-it on my laptop. Chris, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think that sort of ongoing communication as well, because quite often rolling out a CRM, especially if it's some of the more complex platforms, takes a very long time. HubSpot, you tend to be able to do it faster, which is a really positive thing, because people aren't going, oh, a new CRM's coming, going through a scoping process and then waiting a year for something to happen, or even 18 months. It's a really long time. You've kind of got to keep them engaged, keep those comms, and I think also just keep proving that you've listened. So all that stuff about that we talked about at the start of finding out how we can make it better for them, it's kind of meaningless if we're not able to go back and say, we listened, we know this was a problem for you before, we've taken it away, here it is for you, can you test it for me and tell me what you think? So proving that you've listened, I think, is really vital here. Amazing.
And I think we've kind of talked about this a little bit, in that it's all long term. This isn't, you're going to start it today and it's going to be finished in 18 months, 6 weeks, however long it takes. I don't want to say forever, but it's going to go on forever, because you don't want to just get them to adopt it. You want them to utilize it. So to you, Chris, firstly, what does that utilization mean to you?
It's people keeping using it the way that they started using it. So it's not that sort of what you typically see with a bad rollout. It's that somebody will put the big boot on, everybody will log in on day one, and then you just get gradual decay. So you have to it's that sort of yes adoption. We can tell people they have to adopt something, write it into their contract, but we have to drive ongoing utilization by a lot of the things that we've talked about. But it's making it easy for people to do it. I think it's really vital. Good training, the right training. So, in a lot of cases, training people to do what they need to do rather than going in and going, right, we're going to open up the fire hose and we're going to drop every single bit of knowledge about this platform on you. And they walk away. They don't know what they're supposed to do. They're confused. In the early stages, you've got to keep them, when they get stuck, you've got to get them unstuck fast. They've got to be able to find the answers. And I think, things like Super's really good for that, helping them actually follow their processes and find the answers. I like to embed short videos in HubSpot dashboards as well, so that if somebody gets stuck, they can immediately get unstuck. And I think then also you mentioned ongoing, but it actually should be ongoing, because as soon as you get to that point where you go, right, we've finished, then that's typically where the drop-off will occur. So you've got to keep that buzz, you've got to keep that excitement, you've got to keep listening, and it's almost the case of always be launching, keep the comms going, keep adding something new, keep talking to the users and keep listening to the users.
I like that. I think obviously we know it's going to be going on ongoing, but I wonder, Phil, I haven't asked you this, but if there's any psychological reason why you don't want to be using that terminology. Like, is it better to give people the light at the end of the tunnel? This will be perfect on this date, or should we just be honest right from the start?
So that's interesting. So you're asking, is it like, should you sell the end goal without necessarily revealing how painful it all might be? Is that it?
Yes. Yeah, and I think like giving them a set date, for example, saying 1 year from today, everything's going to be perfect. That you don't know if that's going to be true, but is that going to keep people engaged?
I think with dates, there's definitely a lot of psychology that says breaking down dates or goals into smaller chunks and making them more manageable is definitely a better thing to do. So rather than saying, this car will cost you £40,000 today, you break that down and say it will cost you £11 for the next 10 years for the car's duration. Suddenly that's much more appealing. And the same will be true for adoption, saying you'll learn something new every week and by the end of it you'll be an expert, is much better than saying you have to learn 52 things this year in order to be an expert. So that's one thing as well. Another thing to consider with dates is, when do you get them to start? There's some really interesting psychology around something called the fresh start effect, which was really popularized by a researcher called Katie Milkman in her book How to Change. And she found that she was encouraging people to adopt different behaviors. So she works at university, encouraging students to adopt into saving benefits or going to the gym. And the way you label the date you want people to start dramatically changes how likely people are to start. So it turns out if you tell people, oh, start this new activity on Monday, the 14th of March, or January the 4th of 2024, that's the actual date. That's what most people do. That is actually less effective than using what Katie Milkman calls these fresh start dates. And these are dates with labels like the first day of the week, or the first day of spring, or the new year, or the new financial year. Using these dates, which have this bigger significance in our minds, makes people far more likely to make a change. And the reason why comes back to the psychology behind New Year's resolutions. When we get to what we consider to be a fresh start in our mind, and that could be as simple as a new week or a new year or a new millennium, people are far more likely to change their habits. So yeah, two things there. One is consider the date you want people to start, and maybe build it into a date which is the start of a new quarter or the start of a new month, a classic time when people would be making changes anyway. And then also break down the goals they have to achieve, because throwing them everything at once will be much more difficult than saying do this one simple thing each week.
Yeah, definitely don't start on Friday. Nobody at 2:00 on a Friday afternoon, kickoff call, nobody's going to be interested in that.
Yeah. Whereas Monday, and even saying like, whilst you get your morning coffee to start the week off on a Monday, that really feels like a significant moment in people's minds that they start new habits on, they start new projects on. And I think you can benefit from picking that date. I
love that. So turning into a moment for them. Okay, great. So I think that's all of our questions that I have for you guys. Before we jump into the Q&A and see if we've got any questions there, is there anything you guys want to add? I feel like there's been so many tips, tricks that you guys have all shared. Any thoughts from each of you?
I have one or two, maybe three, but I'll keep it short. Number one, a great way to increase adoption in the American context is have a British person talk about it. It will make them instantly inspire them. I know that sounds weird, but it's like there's studies, I promise, Phil. Number two is product is, I think this is this is a point of view is, and Chris, you mentioned this a bit. It is a CRM is a product. And why do I say that? Often a CRM is actually an agglomeration of tools. I mean, we talk about the HubSpot context, which that's why it's better. It's one system, but you never work on just one tool. You're actually context switching over and over. You're moving from CRM to CPQ to ERP. And the RevOps person, and this is studied by Gartner and Forrester and others, is you are 2.7 times more revenue when you have a RevOps person. That is because the RevOps person is constantly thinking about the end state of adoption. Each user is an adopter. So when I think about this ongoing support, I use words like retention. You want user retention. We call it everboarding. The reason I never cohort reporting, when you have new people starting, you have new cohorts of people that actually have different adoption rates. We will be launching a full HubSpot adoption that does this as part of Super, but we need to be thinking in terms of taking subscription-like ideas that have spent a lot of time using a lot of psychology to understand them and applying them to adoption of a CRM. I think that's very helpful context. And number two, why I'm actually push against very strongly the idea of utilization in this context. And why is because service companies use utilization because they're counting hours. And they think of it, I have a finite amount of resources, and these resources must be utilized so that I can understand what my profit margins are. That is not how a product thinks. A product is about adoption and user attention and about behavior. Utilization is a number of hours and how long I'm spending on something. So I don't like there's different points, but I just like to not mix those two concepts. And I feel very strongly that a HubSpot, if it was a project and I was doing waterfall math, I would think of utilization. If I'm doing product and I'm thinking about adoption, I'm now thinking in terms of adoption, retention, cohort reporting, et cetera. Anyway, it's a helpful concept for me that has helped rethink the way I even implement or launch products, right? Or CRMs. That's it. I liked in there.
No, I think that's really great. I think, I think that context around what we mean by utilization is so important. We don't want people just using it, logging, I've spent half an hour doing this week. No, we want you to be using it efficiently, correctly, against process, making your life easier. I think that was really helpful, actually. One question that we've got actually, which I think is really interesting, is: do any of you have experience of gamification for increasing adoption? I'd love that.
It can work very well. It can also be dangerous if you try and game for the wrong kind of people. So one of the things you'll find is that, salespeople will skew. Personality type will probably be an I or a yellow. They might have a bit of red in there. They're going to be competitive. But you might have You might want your content team or something like that who are going to skew green, blue. They're less likely to be excited by the gamification. So it can be incredibly effective, but you have to be really, really careful how you apply it, because it can go badly wrong if you end up with, half the team can't see any impact. They can't see that they're getting any points or prizes or anything, and they will just give up, and you can lose them straight away. So it can be incredibly powerful, but has to be applied very carefully.
So maybe depending on the team. So I can see like a sales team, I feel like you can assume that they're going to be quite competitive. So that would work for them. But yeah, you're right. Maybe not the content writers. After the initial rollout of an implementation, what resources do you recommend for ongoing training? I can take one for the. We've got an adoption. Well, actually, that's not after initial rollout. Go on, Matt. I saw you on mute. You could take this one.
Yeah, it goes to that point, and I think this is important. Is you need to plan for. You need the resources. There's two contexts, and I've almost answered this question. Just reframing it is. If you have you've rolled out a CRM, there are two users. Think of them as cohorts. You have two different cohorts. You have the people who started during the initial, and you have people who have started post deployment. So you must solve for both those individuals. New onboarding training, and then also everboarding. And I'll think about them as onboarding, new, and then everboarding you're doing afterwards. Still, you must answer who, what, when, where, why in all places. And it must be immediately accessible. So traditionally, people write I've written 50-page sales documentations that people can look up. They never read it. And they ask you the questions in Slack. And so there is modern ways of doing that. You can use Guru to have a Chrome extension that allows you to have access. This is one of the things Super does extremely well, where you can put all your documentation that's now searchable and accessible immediately in the flow of work. We call it just-in-time learning. The other portion is people traditionally do LMSs, where you have a learning management system where you can periodically have people retrain or do knowledge checks. I also think the way behavior is changing is LMS is no longer I actually hate doing LMSs. I hate all training. Hate's a strong word. I dislike them and don't provide value in my life. I think that we are now moving to dynamically serve content, giving you the next best action that is served based on the process that exists. And so there are ways to now dynamically serve content when it's actually needed, in the moment it's needed, in the location it's needed. And so I would think in those ways, who, what, when, where, why, and train them in the place they are and try not to bring them away from the place they are. And if you do those things, you will have an everboard and you have an onboarding program.
Amazing. Thank you. We've got a couple more questions. So using the subscription idea that Matthew's mentioned, has anyone used workflows to try and drive adoption by sending emails to users to prompt them to use the system? So I know that's if you're using an app, for example, and you haven't used it for a while, you get a reminder email to be like, you haven't used this for a while. I'm guessing that's the kind of thing that Olivia is asking. So who wants to take that one? Chris.
I can have a bash. Yeah, I think, yes, it can be effective, but it's got to be, you've got to think about the types of people that you're dealing with and how to motivate them. So me, for example, if I get something from an app saying you haven't used it for a while, what's the one I use? Duolingo. I use it with my daughter. We learn Spanish. I've recently got rid of it because all the notifications, you haven't done it yet, that doesn't work on me, drives me up the wall. For some people, it does. So thinking about what the people are actually trying to do and how you can use those emails to serve them content that's actually going to make their life better. Here's a little thing you forgot about that's actually going to help you close more deals, for example, can be powerful. But you've got to think through it. And really long emails, they're not going to work terribly well either, because especially with the sales team, nobody's going to read them. So quick tips, useful things that they can do that are going to make their lives better, I think is the key there.
So tying it back to that initial step of understanding what their barriers are, and address it a bit like marketing. You're addressing their pain points, making it personal to them. Great. We've got a few more. So how do you manage if you have one person quite senior on the rest and influential on the rest of the team, but they're negative and a detractor?
I can take this one. You tell them that they're ruining everything. So I mean this in the most loving possible way. Is if you have someone that is using their authority to decrease detractors, you will not have a successful implementation of a CRM, no matter how well it's done, because that authority like goes through. And so unless confronted in a loving way, saying, hey, here's where we're trying to go. And then I ask the question, do you believe? And if they don't believe, there's a reason, and then you can address that. But it must be direct. It cannot be passive. But that's a point of view, especially at the top. And I would even question if you've started and you have someone at the top that hasn't, you may have missed one of the portions of listening because they are not getting something answered daily, weekly, or monthly. And if you can say, okay, what are you missing daily? What are you missing weekly, monthly? If I can provide that, will you believe? And they say yes, then you provide it. And that's how I'd address those.
That makes sense. Just going to whiz through the last couple. So if you've started a project, an adoption project, implementation, and it's not going the way that you want, do you start again? Do you keep going? Do you change tactics? How soon do you know when to act? That's a lot of questions, but it's all in one topic, I suppose. Anyone got any advice for them?
Yeah, I can give some potentially too vague advice, but I can definitely try. I think one thing I would say is definitely try and talk. Once you've started to push adoption, you can start to run tests and you can start to see if something works more than another. I think there's lots you can do. I've just been reading a really interesting book called Writing for Busy Readers. It's by a researcher called Todd Howard, I think. And his whole point is that all of us write too much. And if we reduce the amount of words we write, the amount of adoption we get, the amount of engagement we get will dramatically increase. And he's run experiments with huge newsletters, huge onboarding campaigns. And he's just encouraged them to make that write in plain English, use metaphors that are easy to understand, and reduce the amount of language. And he's shared one study, which I think was amazing. It was an email to parents of kids who are being truant at school, so kids who are skipping school. And this email was just automated, would go out to everyone. So a bit like this sort of adoption plan that might be going out to everyone. And all he encouraged them to do was to reduce the length of this email. And so he did it. They reduced the length of the email. And then truancy in kids actually fell, I think, by half, which is kind of incredible if you think that, which is just an email to a parent, had that much of an effect. But what was happening was the parent just clearly wasn't reading it, wasn't paying enough attention to it. By reducing the content, they engaged. And I think that is really a good reason why you shouldn't just start again, try something else. But tweaking what you're working on can really help, because if you tweak it, you might actually realize, oh, this is working. We just needed to change the language, that sort of thing.
Amazing. I keep thinking about that email now and how I need to change some of my marketing emails that might be going out in the next couple of weeks. Anyone got any insight on which teams have the most barriers, if any? Was that
everybody would probably get the same answer there, won't they? Does it a word that begins with S, perhaps?
And it ends in sales?
I've always found that sales teams are. They typically do present the most barriers, but it's because quite often a new system, a new CRM will just be designed and it doesn't help them. You know, I want to build a system, implement it, train a sales team, and I want that salesperson the next day. If I said to them, right, I'm going to take this away from you now, I want them to say, no, how dare you? I like it. So it's that listening, understanding, making something that works for them. You've got to actually help them do their job. It's got to be easier to do it in their HubSpot system than it is to pick up the phone, scribble on a piece of paper, whatever else it is. But that is my findings, that sales are typically the most difficult.
Okay, amazing. Right, I think we've answered all of the questions. There is one from Olivia about embedding videos in a dashboard. We can send over a link to some instructions on how to do that. I think
Matt's answered that one in the chat.
Amazing. You beat us to it. Great. I think that's everything. So on that note, a big thank you, Phil, Matt, Chris. I've definitely learned a lot today. So everybody else, keep an eye out on your emails. We'll send through a link to our next hug, where it's going to be specifically about sales teams. And we'll send over some links to some guides, some blogs, etc. that you can
Just
a
couple of questions for me. One for each of you. Matt, how do we find out more about Supered?
You can LinkedIn on my profile. I post every day about adoption /Supered. You can feel free to unfollow me if you get annoyed.
and Phil, where can we? Where's the best place to get Nudge in our ears?
Yeah, just search for Nudge, Nudge. You'll see an orange logo on your podcast player, also on YouTube and TikTok as well if you want to be on there. And then I'm Phil Agnew. You can search for me on LinkedIn. If you've got any questions, feel free to just ask me them on LinkedIn after this. But yeah, thanks so much for having me, folks.
Thank you. And thank you both of you. It's been really interesting. We'll go on talking about this all afternoon, I think. I'm going to stop now.
But we have run over. So I'm going to link Phil's podcast in the email I'll send around. And I will also link Supered as well for Matt and both of their LinkedIn profiles. So you can give them both a follow. And Chris, obviously, not forgetting Chris. Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a good week.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, everyone.
Stay awesome. Keep doing it big. Never stop.